Hello, pattern readers. As you probably know, we've been in a bonanza of marketing content for The Wheel of Time Season 1. There's been so much new content coming out that I have not been able to comment on all of it. But in the spirit of what I do here on this channel, I wanted to pull out two potentially big book-to-screen changes that these content drops are suggesting and talk about them in more detail. The first is the mystery of who is the Dragon Reborn, potentially including more characters. And the second is Mat's family life and upbringing. Before I get into the details, I want to just make a general clarification. I am going to be talking about some potential changes from the books. And there does seem to be a view out there among some in the fandom that changes are inherently not good, and that the more something changes, the more evidence it is that the show will not be good. I'm not someone who holds this viewpoint. When I talk about changes, it's value neutral. A change is not automatically good or bad. A bigger change is not automatically worse than a smaller change. Everything needs to be evaluated in context. And for me, there's literally always a reason why some things need to change in an adaptation. That's a principle I hold. So we should expect changes, and I'm trying to evaluate the reasons for them and add some context. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Just a heads up, this video will contain book spoilers. I am going to tell you who is the Dragon Reborn in the books. I don't recommend watching this if you haven't read The Eye of the World. There's also a specific spoiler for early in the prequel New Spring, though I don't think that it will ruin your experience of that book to watch this first. Still, use your own discretion. I'm going to sum up the evidence for the broadening of the Who is the Dragon Reborn mystery first. Just keep in mind, not all of these pieces of evidence are consequential, especially on their own, but they all add to the pile of reasons why this is a discussion within the fandom. This question was first raised in a major way with the release of the Moiraine's Quest teaser, which I did break down in depth already. In short, the whole teaser is focused on Moiraine's search for the Dragon Reborn, and there are 3 clues that her primary candidates will include Perrin, Mat, Rand, and Egwene. First, we see all 4 of them waking from nightmares with a voiceover referring to the Dark One, whispering in the back of their minds. Second, we see a quick flash of all 4 of their faces at the end during the words, "Who is the Dragon Reborn?" And finally, Moiraine says she has to find them, not him, which could be a way of keeping it gender neutral. In the full trailer, which was released after, we can also add a line of voiceover where Moiraine says that there will be one who can stand against the Dark One. And, quote, "It's one of the 5 of you." I commented on the oddity of that line at the time because if we're including 5 candidates, not 4, Nynaeve seems to be the only possibility for a 5th candidate from the 2 rivers. However, there's a decent amount of evidence that Nynaeve does not leave the 2 rivers at the same time as the rest of the group and catches up afterward, just as she does in the book. This would not make sense if Moiraine considers Nynaeve to be a potential Dragon Reborn. It also doesn't make sense if we assume Nynaeve is already a Wilder, in which case Moiraine should immediately sense that she channels Saidar, not Saidine. Much more on that later. And finally, we have some evidence that Nynaeve will continue to be at least a few years older than the others in the show, just as she was in the books. Right here in the interactive Explore feature on the Prime Video page for The Wheel of Time, it says so in Nynaeve's character profile. There's also some evidence that that particular line in the trailer might be deliberately misleading. For starters, on this part of the interactive timeline, which is part of the Explore feature, it says Moiraine has heard rumors of 4 young people who potentially match the prophecy of the Dragon Reborn. This next bit gets into some information from scenes that were released at London Comic Con. Not everybody has seen these scenes. I haven't seen them, and I also haven't seen or read detailed breakdowns of them. So I'm not going to really be spoiling anything, but if you don't want to hear the relevant lines that are contradictory to the trailer, go ahead and skip to this timestamp. According to people who have seen these scenes, Moiraine does not say one of the 5 of you. She says one of you. And then later she says the 4 of you need to come with her. So it's super interesting to me that they apparently added the number 5 in the trailer, apparently to misdirect, but it's not super uncommon for trailers and promotional materials. And for someone who hasn't read the books, it probably doesn't mean anything. And for those of us who have, I guess it's just keeping us on our toes. But in any case, I do not think that Nynaeve will be one of the potential candidates. And then most recently, we have this exclusive sneak peek clip in which we have a very relevant quote from Moiraine. Referring to the man who was named Dragon, she says, "Now this man has been born again. We don't know where or to whom. if he was reborn as a girl or a boy. This line has some people in the fandom freaking out, to put it lightly, and talking about how this contradicts the books, etc. So I wanted to talk about the different ways to interpret this line and how it might add to our understanding of how the show is going to tackle this mystery. And I also want to point out that this little clip, this 1 minute clip, has been confirmed to be the first minute of the first episode. So there's no misleading language in this case. This is what Moiraine's voiceover will say in the show. If we look at how Moiraine and Swan and the Amyrlin responded to hearing Gitara Moroso's foretelling in New Spring about the dragon being reborn, they absolutely did assume that the baby being born was a boy child. They dismissed any female babies out of hand. So in that sense, it is a change in that they're not making the assumption that the baby will be male. So what could this mean? I could think of 3 possibilities. One possibility is that in the show, the Aes Sedai will not be aware of the lore that the author was aware of, that souls maintain their gender from rebirth to rebirth. It would still be true, but the Aes Sedai would not know it. Maybe even the prophecies of the dragon had been tampered with to make it unclear what the gender of the dragon would be. That's something a certain Forsaken might be inclined to do. And since our understanding of the show should be that this is another turning of the wheel, why not? Who's to say that the wording of the prophecies would stay the same from turning to turning? In fact, it makes more sense that they wouldn't be. I also find it perfectly reasonable that an Aes Sedai might have an opinion or a perspective on something that she can state. That doesn't make it a fact. In fact, the way that Moiraine talks about Luz Theron and the dragon in this little voiceover suggests that maybe she doesn't have a fully accurate perspective on how the events that led to the breaking went down. A second possibility is that the lore in the show will change, that souls don't have to maintain their gender from rebirth to rebirth. This seems to be the possibility that has most people on edge. I don't actually see any particular reason to jump to this explanation when there are simpler and easier explanations that exist. Why assume that this is the case when there are other less extreme interpretations of this line that make a lot more sense? Many people seem to want to leap further from this idea to assumptions such as Rand will not be the dragon reborn in the show. I've talked about that before. I honestly think that's just absurd. Yes, they want to create more of a mystery for people who haven't read the books, but they're not going to change the outcome. In no way do I believe for 1 second that they're going to change who actually is the dragon reborn. But it's hard to argue against ideas like this because there's just no actual evidence to lead us to these conclusions. But if they did change the lore about souls, would that be a terrible thing? Not necessarily. To me, it would potentially change how our understanding of gender is reflected in the series, and that could be a good or a bad thing. But the whole idea is just lacking so much context that there's really no way to evaluate it without making a million assumptions first, which I'm just not inclined to do. Another extrapolation from this second possibility are people questioning whether the 2 halves of the one power, saidin and saidar, will even be included in the show. Will they do away with that gender division altogether? To be fair, those words, saidin and saidar, had not been mentioned in any of the promotional materials so far. But that's not all that surprising to me. These terms are essentially jargon, and if they're used without an accompanying specific explanation, they're alienating to a new audience. You really can't stop to give explanations like that in a trailer, and even in an article, it might be a sort of tangent that would get people to stop reading. In the show, it's easy enough to have Moiraine explain these terms to Egwene and have it work, but it wouldn't make for a very exciting promotional clip. So I see no reason to assume that they are changing this. To me, it's a pretty fundamental and emblematic concept of the ways that when men and women are separated, they cannot accomplish as much as they can when they work together. I also want to point out that the show has in multiple ways gone out of their way to include imagery of the ancient Aes Sedai symbol for saidin and saidar, as well as the individual symbols of the flame of Tarvalon and the dragon's fang. I don't think they would have done that if they were eliminating that aspect from the show. Now for a third possibility. In this case, rather than knowing less, the Aes Sedai would actually know more. They know that souls maintain their gender from rebirth to rebirth, but they also are aware that a male soul can be reborn into a female body. This is something that we actually see happen in the books, although in that instance, it's through Dark One interference. This is always something that I thought should be expanded upon in the show. We should in some way be shown that a soul being born into a body that does not match their gender is something that can also happen naturally without Dark One interference. If it does happen naturally, it's simply a validation of the existence of trans people. And because trans people exist in our world, they should also exist in the Wheel of Time, which is conceived to be just a different age of our world. If the Aes Sedai are aware of the existence of trans people, then they shouldn't be ruling out female babies, because if the dragon were to be a trans man instead of a cis man, he would be born in a female body. To me, this is the simplest explanation and interpretation of Moiraine's line in that teaser. And it really wouldn't have to change anything else about the prophecies or the plot. In this scenario, we would still know that the dragon would be a saidin channeler, so we'd still have that reason to fear him, among others. We already have real reasons to fear him anyway. He would very likely go mad regardless of saidin, just from the sheer pressure that he is under. And his birth signals that Tarmon Gai'dan is right around the corner. But in this case, we even still have the saidin component. So let's go with this scenario for a bit, because I think it's the one that has the most reasons to be accurate. So in this scenario, Moiraine would show up in the Two Rivers looking for a young adult of a certain age. All it would take to include Egwene is to age her up a little bit and give her a birthday that is close to Rand's, and then she could be considered as well. Now, she'd probably be ruled out pretty quickly by Moiraine, at least, once she can sense that Egwene can channel saidar. But it would be enough. In the books, we really don't know how certain Moiraine may have been from the beginning that it was Rand all along. She might have been nearly certain from the beginning. But she wouldn't leave Mat and Perrin behind anyway, because they had also been targeted by the Shadow. And it turns out she was right, because they're also ta'veren. It sure looks like the Shadow was targeting Egwene in the show, because look at what happens to the Winespring Inn. I've talked before about the possibility that Egwene might also be ta'veren in my Moiraine's Quest video. And look, this is again another turning of the wheel. Maybe Egwene is needed as a fourth ta'veren in this turning. And I do not accept the argument that her being ta'veren would diminish her accomplishments, because no one says that about Rand's accomplishments or Mat's or Perrin's. And look, we know for sure that the Winespring is almost all destroyed. Imagine for a second that they had chosen to do that and then left it as Egwene doesn't have to leave, but she just does anyway because she chooses to. She'd be leaving her mother and her family behind to that destruction just because she wanted to go. That's really untenable for her character. So once the decision was made to do this much damage to the village and to the Winespring, they really needed to give Egwene a reason to leave as well. And I don't think this has to fundamentally change her character either. She can still be the most eager, the most accepting of this change in their lives, while the others are more reluctant. Some people still argue, why was any of this needed? There was no reason to make any of these changes from the books. Well, here are a few in my mind. I've already mentioned my opinion that given the gender dynamics in the books, there really needed to be an explicit acknowledgement of the existence of trans people. Well, right here from the beginning, they've done that. And it also puts Egwene immediately on equal footing in terms of character importance with Rand and Mat and Perrin. Now, I already think she has that equal importance in the books, but that might not be immediately obvious to some people. Many people seem to put Rand and Mat and Perrin in their own top tier. I don't think that's accurate to the books in terms of POV chapters or word counts, but it is a perception that some people have. And I think it's one that's good for the show to not play into and just to present that all four of these characters are really essential right from the beginning. This isn't about elevating women in some way that is contrary to the books, as some internet commenters would have us believe. This is about having an appropriate balance of character perspectives right from the beginning, something that's really far more important in a TV show than it is even in a book. This really can't be Rand's show, as I've talked about for many reasons before. But if they hewed too closely to the eye of the world, it would feel like Rand's show, with the other characters just as supporting, instead of a true ensemble. Yes, they are already elevating the perspective of Moiraine in the first season by starting the show with her POV. But I think anyone who has read the books knows that the centrality of Moiraine is not going to last for an entire run of the show. But they have a huge star on their hands in Rosamund Pike, and they are taking full advantage of that while they can, and giving their younger stars a chance to grow into their roles and win over the audience. So yes, they seem to be positioning Madeline Madden as a secondary female lead, poised to ascend to a primary lead when Moiraine must inevitably recede. A central theme of these books is the need for balance among genders and everything that goes wrong when things are out of balance. So none of this is contrary to the most important aspects of the books. By the way, if you're someone who thinks that the show choosing to acknowledge that trans people exist or that women are important in the Wheel of Time makes something, quote, woke, you probably hate watching my channel anyway. So glad I could give you some more fodder. Enjoy. I think I've said enough on that topic for now, so let's talk about Matt, because there's some controversy there too. In the interactive Explore feature I mentioned before, many people reacted to something in Matt's character profile. By the way, this feature is really cool and also includes a map and a timeline that I expect will be added to as the show goes on. Definitely check it out. But for now, Matt. Matt is always ready with a smart remark and loves to make people laugh. And yet his mischievous smile and witty retorts simply distract from the question constantly burdening him. Is he a good person? And how would he know? His parents were far from role models, yet he fears himself fated to follow their path. But perhaps, if that Aes Sedai is to be trusted, his future may have other things in store. We also have some cast interviews, which were featured in a video on IGN, which I will link for you. Some of what Barney Harris had to say about Matt also matched with his character profile. He discusses Matt's inner monologue being that he sees himself as a bad person, but that his actions are good. He doesn't mention Matt's parents, but he does mention poverty. So I think we can conclude at least that the show will explore the idea that Matt has doubts about whether he is a good person, and that this will have something to do with his upbringing, his poverty, and the fact that his parents were not good role models. To many people, the aspects about poverty and his parents feels like a divergence, so I wanted to explore that a little bit. It's open for some debate. I don't think there's anything in the books to suggest that the Cothans were not well thought of generally. Matt is thought of as a good-natured scoundrel, but the Cothans were certainly not thought of in the category of, say, the Coplans or the Congers. When it comes to Abel, he is known for his skill with the quarterstaff and the bow. He's a farmer and a horse trader. Abel is also someone who at least comes to be trusted by characters we trust, like Tam Al'Thor and Perrin Ibarra. I wouldn't assume that anyone in the Two Rivers is particularly prosperous. The Alvirs may be slightly more than most, but I don't think there was anything that suggested that the Cothans were poorer than average. Now, the fact that Abel Cothan was a horse trader is something that is a little bit interesting because it does seem like there is some negative connotation built into that term. Per Wikipedia, due to the difficulties in evaluating the merits of a horse offered for sale, the sale of horses offered great opportunities for dishonesty, leading to use of the term horse trading to refer to complex bargaining or other transactions, such as political vote trading. It was expected that horse sellers would capitalize on these opportunities, and so those who dealt in horses gained a reputation for underhanded business practices. To be honest, I think the idea that Abel Cothan might be underhanded, or that the family life of the Cothans might be in some way dysfunctional, is a change from the books. But as I've said before, to me that doesn't say anything about whether that's a good decision or a bad decision. Here I'm going to be more speculative, but I want to talk about some of the potential reasons for these changes. I like the idea that Matt is questioning whether he is a good person. It fits right in with his frequent claim that he is no bloody hero, even while performing tasks that are overtly heroic. It also fits in with this thing that we know about Matt, that his inner monologue and his offhand words never seem to match up with his actions. He is heroic, he is caring, he is responsible, even though he never thinks of himself in that way and always claims not to be. But the show has a challenge on their hands because they don't get to have an inner monologue. Yeah, they can still have Matt saying he's no bloody hero. But you know what? Rand and Perrin say pretty much the same things in their own ways. Rand says he's just a sheep herder. Perrin is afraid to be a leader and to lose control to his wolf side. So how can we differentiate Matt and add more stakes to his journey at the same time? Matt having to prove to himself that he is a good person because of a challenging upbringing is interesting. It adds some layers and complexity to what is already there. And if we get to see some of these dynamics play out among the Cothan family, it allows the show to let us see and explain why Matt might think the way he does. Maybe his parents think he's not going to amount to anything. Maybe Matt sees their flaws and is afraid that he's going to follow in their footsteps. If he is poor, it explains his greater interest in riches without making him seem greedy. Maybe all of this can add up to explain why Matt does one of the most maddening things in the Eye of the World, taking the Shadar Logoth dagger. I know I was super annoyed with Matt for doing that. Maybe this time I'll actually have some sympathy for him. To me, both of these changes really feel like they are just adding layers to what's in the books, not like wild departures. The change to Matt's family may be a little bit more of a departure, but the changes are still in the details to me, not the fundamentals. And in both cases, I can see really good potential reasons for them. So I'm very interested to see where the show will go with these added elements. Again, the thing I always try to keep in the forefront of my mind is that we shouldn't really judge a change until we see it in its full context. I feel intrigued by and open to these changes, but it won't be until we really see how they are fully executed in the show that we'll be able to say for sure whether these were good decisions or bad decisions. There's probably also a million other factors related to these decisions that we just can't possibly know because we're not in the writer's room figuring out how to condense a 15-book epic into 8-ish seasons. But I feel better whenever I remember that there are people in that writer's room who do care deeply about the heart of the books and the success of the show. Finally, for fun, let me throw out a couple other possible changes for your consideration. There are a couple of surprising locations on the interactive map. The most surprising is the Kingdom of Tyr, which we don't see until book 3. How is that going to be included in season 1? Knowing that we have young Swan, played by Kira Chansa, in the season, that's the easiest explanation, that we will see her in the fishing village she grew up in. I doubt they will have bothered to create the whole city of Tyr or the Stone of Tyr when there won't be significant plot points in those locations in this season. And then we have the village of Breen Spring, a name mentioned only as a throwaway as a location on the Camelin Road in the Eye of the World. Based on this photo, it seems to have been filmed in Velka, America, and it seems like this will be a location for Rand and Matt, and most likely where they meet Tom. I think they may have chosen a random village rather than a more known one like Four Kings, because they won't be sticking too closely to that chapter of the book. But I still expect some Darkfriend and maybe Shadow Spawn encounters for Rand and Matt there. As always, I want to hear all your thoughts on these changes in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, like and share it. Most importantly, be a subscriber. There's so much good stuff coming. And until next time, gird your loins, my friends.